In the early hours of a quiet summer morning, a small Midwestern town slept, unaware that it would wake to a horror so complete, so intimate, that it would fracture its sense of safety forever. They were found where people are supposed to be safest, tucked under blankets, asleep, unaware. 8 people, 1 house, no survivors. By sunrise, Villisca, Iowa would become a name whispered across America, synonymous with fear, suspicion, and a question that would never truly be answered. Who could walk into a family's home and leave no one alive? Welcome to Unimaginable True Crimes. Here, we expose the unimaginable, one case at a time. In 1912, Villisca was the kind of town people dreamed of. With fewer than 2,500 residents, it was built on routine and familiarity. Doors were rarely locked. Neighbors knew one another's schedules. Children played freely in the streets until dusk. There was no reason to expect violence, especially not in the home of Josiah Moore, a respected businessman, churchgoer, and family man. He lived on 2nd Street with his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 visiting girls who had been invited for a sleepover after Sunday services. That invitation would seal their fate. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the Moore family attended church. They laughed, sang hymns, and walked home together under a calm Iowa sky. Nothing about that night stood out. No arguments, no strange visitors, no sense of dread. The children went to bed, the house went dark, and sometime after midnight, someone entered. It was around 5 a.m. when a neighbor noticed something unusual. The Moore household was unusually quiet. Curtains were drawn, no one was stirring. Concern turned to alarm when knocking went unanswered. By mid-morning, the truth was discovered. Inside the house lay 8 bodies. Every victim had been struck repeatedly with an axe, most while they slept. The killer had moved methodically from room to room, attacking each person in their bed. No one had a chance to scream. No one escaped. And perhaps most chilling of all, after the murders, the killer had taken time. Time to wash. Time to cover mirrors and windows. Time to leave food behind. This was not a panicked act. It was deliberate. When authorities arrived, even seasoned lawmen struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The weapon? An axe believed to belong to the Moore family themselves. The wounds? Overkill, excessive, personal. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant the killer either had a key or was welcomed inside. Each bedroom told the same story. Parents slain in their sleep, children struck where they lay, visiting guests murdered just hours after being invited into the home. The randomness was unbearable. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. News traveled fast. Within days, Villisca was flooded with reporters, curiosity seekers, and amateur detectives. Families locked their doors for the first time. Some fled town altogether. Parents sat awake at night listening, because the killer had never been caught and he might still be nearby. Authorities questioned neighbors, traveling workers, even members of the Moore family's church. Suspicion fell on outsiders first, because the alternative was too terrifying to accept. What if the killer was one of them? Evidence was mishandled. The crime scene was contaminated by crowds. Potential clues were destroyed by curiosity and chaos. And with every passing day, the case slipped further from resolution. This wasn't just mass murder. It was a violation of the most sacred boundary, the bedroom. People stopped sleeping easily. Children were kept close. Trust evaporated. Villisca didn't just lose 8 lives, it lost its innocence. Over time, theories multiplied. A drifter, a serial killer, a jealous acquaintance, a religious fanatic. Names would come and go, but the house on 2nd Street would remain, silent, empty, watching. By the 2nd week after the murders, Villisca was no longer just grieving. It was hunting. Fear has a way of sharpening suspicion, and in a town this small, everyone suddenly looked different. Familiar faces became unsettling. Ordinary habits were reinterpreted as secrets. The question whispered behind closed doors was the same everywhere. Who among us could have done this? Investigators, overwhelmed and inexperienced with crimes of this magnitude, did what many small-town police departments did in the early 1900s. They looked outward. Railroads cut through Iowa like veins, carrying farmhands, preachers, drifters, and salesmen from town to town. Transient men became immediate suspects, because if the killer was passing through, Villisca wouldn't have to live with the truth. Local law enforcement questioned dozens of itinerant workers. Men were detained simply for being nearby. Some were beaten for confessions that never came. None stuck. And as the days passed, an unsettling realization emerged. The killer had known the house. The Moore home showed no signs of a break-in. Doors were intact, windows were locked. Even more disturbing, the killer appeared to have waited inside the house, possibly hiding in the attic until the family fell asleep. That detail changed everything, because it suggested patience and planning. One name began circulating, quietly at first: George Kelly. Kelly was an itinerant preacher who had been in Villisca the night of the murders. He attended the same church service as the Moore family, sitting only a few rows away. He had asked to stay with the Moores that night. They said no. That fact alone chilled the town. Kelly was described as odd, socially awkward, and intensely religious. Children made him uneasy, adults found him unsettling. After the murders, witnesses reported seeing Kelly wandering the streets in the early morning hours, sweating, agitated, muttering to himself. He left town abruptly the next day. When police later questioned him, his behavior grew more disturbing. Under intense interrogation, lasting hours, sometimes days, Kelly eventually confessed. He described the murders in vivid detail. Too vivid. He spoke of the axe, the rooms, the sequence of attacks. For a brief moment, Villisca thought it had its answer. But then the confession unraveled. Kelly recanted, claiming he had been coerced, exhausted, and confused. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No blood on his clothing, no witnesses placing him inside the house. The confession alone was not enough, and in court, it collapsed. Kelly's trial didn't bring closure. It fractured Villisca further. Some believed he was guilty, convinced no innocent man would confess to such horror. Others believed the police had broken him psychologically, desperate for answers they couldn't find. When Kelly was acquitted, fear returned in full force. Because if he wasn't the killer, then who was? With outsiders failing to satisfy, eyes turned closer to home. Neighbors were scrutinized, family friends were questioned. Even the Moore family's personal relationships were dissected for hidden resentments. Nothing concrete emerged. What did emerge was paranoia. Parents slept with weapons nearby. Town meetings grew tense. Every unfamiliar noise after dark felt like a threat. Villisca was no longer a town. It was a watchful organism. As similar axe murders were reported across the Midwest, investigators began to suspect something even darker: a traveling killer, moving from town to town, striking families in their sleep. The method was hauntingly consistent. Families attacked at night, axes taken from the home, mirrors covered, windows draped. If true, Villisca wasn't unique. It was one stop on a trail of terror. A serial killer meant the murders might never be solved. It meant the killer didn't know the Moores personally, and it meant Villisca was chosen at random. There is nothing more terrifying than randomness. Months passed, then years.
Suspects faded, evidence deteriorated, witnesses moved away or died. The house remained empty. Children dared each other to run past it at night. Parents warned them never to go near it. Because even without answers, everyone felt the same truth. Whatever happened in that house did not end with the murders.
By the time Villisca realized the truth, it was already too late. The murders were not an isolated nightmare. They were a pattern. And patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. In the months following the Villisca murders, investigators began noticing unsettling similarities between crimes reported across the Midwest. Different towns, different families, same method. Entire households killed in their beds. Axes taken from inside the home, mirrors covered, windows draped, and always silence. What terrified law enforcement wasn't just the repetition, it was the confidence. Whoever was responsible didn't rush, he didn't panic, he didn't leave behind obvious mistakes. He seemed to move through homes with familiarity, patience, and purpose. This wasn't rage, this was ritual. As records were reviewed and timelines compared, a chilling map emerged, one that stretched across multiple states. In Colorado Springs, a family slaughtered in their sleep. In Kansas, a similar attack. In Illinois and Indiana, more bodies, more axes, more unanswered questions. The most striking parallel came just months after Villisca, in La Porta, Indiana, where another family was murdered in nearly identical fashion. The killer had not been caught, he had simply moved on. If the murders were connected, then Villisca had never truly been investigating a local crime. It had been part of a regional hunt. That realization was devastating, because it meant the killer might never return, the town might never get answers, justice could be forever out of reach. The fear that had once felt personal now felt cosmic, like Villisca had brushed against something vast and unknowable. One detail from the Moore house began to take on new significance: the attic. Investigators found evidence suggesting someone may have hidden there, waiting, watching, listening as the family settled into bed below. Dust disturbed, an open panel, no signs of forced entry. If true, the killer had entered the house hours earlier and waited in complete silence. That possibility haunted everyone who heard it, because it meant the killer didn't just attack families, he studied them. A common question followed every discussion of the case. How could 8 people be murdered without anyone waking the town? The answer lay in the weapon and the method. The axe was swung blunt side first in some cases, knocking victims unconscious before fatal blows were delivered. The killer moved room to room, ensuring no one had time to react. This wasn't frenzy, it was control. Railroads connected every town touched by these murders. They provided anonymity, mobility, escape. A killer could strike, disappear, and be hundreds of miles away within hours. For investigators in 1912, this was an impossible adversary. No national databases, no centralized policing, no way to track movement across states. The killer existed in the gaps of the system. Evidence collection in the early 1900s was primitive. Scenes were contaminated, crowds trampled clues, records were poorly preserved. In Villisca, well-meaning townspeople had entered the house before police could secure it. Curious visitors touched walls, floors, even bodies. Every fingerprint was ruined, every trail was blurred. The case didn't just go cold, it decomposed. As years passed, the Moore house took on a life of its own. It stood empty, yet never abandoned. People claimed to hear footsteps. Children refused to walk past it. Travelers stopped to stare. The house became a reminder of what happens when evil enters a place that believes itself safe and leaves unanswered. Some crimes fade because they are solved. Others endure because they are not. The Villisca Axe Murders lived on because they struck at something fundamental, the belief that home is protection. That belief never fully returned. Was Villisca the work of a local man who vanished? Or was it the work of a serial killer whose name was never known, who left behind a trail of bodies and a century of silence? There is no consensus, only echoes. Life eventually resumed in Villisca.
Children were born, businesses reopened, generations passed. But the story was always there, told in lowered voices, shared with warnings, remembered with unease. Because some histories don't belong to the past, they linger.
Long after the suspects faded and the evidence crumbled, one thing in Villisca refused to move on: the house. The white wood-framed home on 2nd Street remained standing, unchanged in structure, but permanently altered in meaning. Where it once symbolized family, faith, and stability, it now represented something far darker. People didn't call it the Moore House anymore. They called it the Axe Murder House. From the outside, the house looked ordinary, even welcoming on bright summer days. Curtains in the windows, a modest porch, a yard that once held children's laughter. But step inside and the air felt different. Visitors described an immediate heaviness, an oppressive silence that pressed inward. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the sense of intrusion, as though the house remembered something you didn't and resented you for being there. For decades, locals avoided the house, but outsiders were drawn to it. Journalists, paranormal investigators, true crime enthusiasts. Some came seeking answers, others came seeking proof that evil leaves an imprint. What many didn't expect was how personal the experience would feel. As early as the 1920s, stories began circulating, doors opening on their own, unexplained footsteps at night, the sound of children crying when no one else was present. At first, these stories were dismissed as grief-fueled imagination, but they never stopped, and over time they multiplied. One detail appeared again and again in accounts from visitors who stayed overnight: they couldn't sleep. Some reported feeling watched, others described sudden nausea, headaches, or intense dread the moment they lay down. A few claimed to feel pressure on their chests, like someone sitting on the bed. Whether psychological or something else, the result was the same: people left early. The attic remained the most unsettling space in the house. Visitors described drastic temperature changes, sudden cold, an overwhelming sense of unease. Some refused to enter it at all, and always the same thought returned: what if the killer really waited here, listening to breathing below, counting footsteps, choosing the moment? The attic wasn't just a room, it was a possibility. Eventually, the home was purchased and restored, not to erase its history, but to preserve it. The Villisca Axe Murder House became a museum and later a place where people could stay overnight. That decision sparked controversy. Some felt it was exploitation, others believed it was the only way to keep the victim's story alive. But no matter the opinion, one thing was certain: the house still commanded attention. Paranormal investigators documented unexplained sounds and movements. Recording equipment captured anomalies, voices, bangs, whispers. Skeptics offered explanations: old wood, drafts, confirmation bias. Believers pointed to consistency. Different people, different decades, same experiences. And none could explain why the house felt aware. Even residents who never set foot inside the home felt its presence. Children grew up hearing warnings. Adults spoke of the murders in hushed tones. The story passed down like folklore, except it was real. The murders didn't just kill 8 people. They rewired how a town understood safety. Because it was never solved, because the killer was never named, because 8 people were murdered in the most vulnerable moment of their lives and no one was held accountable, and because when there is no justice, memory becomes responsibility. Buildings don't talk, but they hold. They absorb moments, movements, pain. And when something imaginably violent happens within their walls, that energy doesn't simply vanish. Whether one believes in the paranormal or not, the Villisca House stands as a witness, silent, unforgiving. The Villisca Axe Murders were not just a crime, they were a rupture. A moment when a small town learned that evil doesn't need chaos to enter, only opportunity. And that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what we see, but what we never find. Do you believe the Villisca murders were part of a larger serial pattern? Could the case ever truly be solved today? Is it ethical to turn crime scenes into tourist sites? Do places retain trauma, or do we project it onto them? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If this story stayed with you, like the video. Subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes. Turn on notifications for the next investigation. Your support keeps these stories alive and accurate. If you think this case was disturbing, the next one begins with a family that vanished overnight and a clue left behind that should never have been ignored. Watch the next true crime investigation now.